The sun was just beginning to rise over the small town, casting a warm golden light across the streets. The air smelled of damp earth and morning dew, and the soft sound of birds chirping created a calm, peaceful atmosphere. Yet, despite the serenity of the morning, a sense of unease lingered in the mind of the person walking briskly toward the old bridge. Every day they took this route, crossing the same worn-out planks, careful not to misstep. The bridge had been neglected for years, a structure that everyone in the town knew was unsafe but continued to use because there was no alternative. It wasn't just a bridge. It was a symbol of the town's neglect and of the people in power who pretended to care but never acted as they approached the bridge. Their eyes scanned the rusting railings and the cracks running through the wooden planks. Each day it seemed worse than the last, and each day the worry grew. They could picture what would happen if the bridge gave way. The thought was terrifying, yet there was a quiet determination that had been growing inside them. Something had to be done. The town's leaders and the HOA had been warned countless times about the dangers, but every warning was met with excuses, empty promises, and laughter behind closed doors. The frustration had built up over the years, like water rising behind a dam. Ready to burst, crossing carefully, they noticed the gaps between the planks had widened. A sense of urgency gripped them. Today would be the day they took a step further. It was not enough to worry silently or to make polite requests that went ignored. The time had come to dig deeper, to find out the truth behind the neglect. There was a growing suspicion that the inaction was not mere laziness. Something darker was at play, something that involved money, power, and the willingness of people to let others suffer for their own gain. The town was small, and everyone knew each other. Gossip traveled faster than the wind, and secrets were hard to keep. But even in such a tight-knit community, corruption had found a way to hide behind smiles and handshakes. The person walking across the bridge had noticed inconsistencies in financial reports, whispers among employees, and unexplained repairs that were never done. They had started keeping notes, taking pictures, and documenting everything, even though it was risky. If the wrong people found out, the consequences could be severe. Still, the thought of doing nothing was unbearable. Once across the bridge, they made their way to a small cafe where they often spent the early mornings planning their next moves. The cafe was quiet at this hour, with only a few early risers sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. The aroma of fresh bread and brewing coffee filled the air, offering a brief sense of comfort before the storm that was brewing in their mind. Sitting at a corner table, they opened a notebook filled with observations, questions, and plans. Each page was a testament to their growing resolve. The handwriting was neat, precise, a reflection of the methodical approach they had chosen. They were not acting on impulse. Every move was carefully calculated, every step thought through. They reflected on the past, on the countless times they had tried to reason with the town leaders and the HOA, meetings that promised solutions but ended in disappointment, phone calls that were never returned, letters that vanished into the void. It was not a lack of effort that had caused the frustration, but the deliberate refusal of those in power to act. That refusal had consequences. People's safety was at risk, and the bridge was just one example. The frustration turned into anger, and the anger fueled a determination that could not be ignored. Outside the cafe, the town was waking up. Children were walking to school, neighbors were greeting each other, and life was going on as usual. But beneath the ordinary routine, there were hidden tensions. The town had its heroes and its villains, its quiet struggles, and its unspoken rules. The person sitting in the cafe knew they were about to step into a role that few wanted to play. They were about to become a force that would challenge the comfort of the powerful, a voice that could not be silenced. It was a daunting thought, but also liberating. For the first time in years, they felt a sense of control over a situation that had long seemed hopeless. They pulled out a folder filled with old reports, photographs, and handwritten notes. The evidence was scattered, incomplete, but it was enough to start building a case. Every photograph of the cracked bridge, every note about missed repairs, every witness account was a piece of a larger puzzle. They spent hours going through the documents, cross-referencing information, and making connections. Patterns began to emerge, revealing a network of negligence and mismanagement that went far beyond the bridge. The problem was systemic, and the person realized that exposing it would not be easy. It would require courage, patience, and a strategy that left no room for error. As they worked, memories of past incidents flashed through their mind. The accident on the bridge, the angry calls to the town council, the cold stares from neighbors who were too afraid to get involved. Each memory was a reminder of the stakes and the cost of inaction. They remembered the fear in people's eyes, the frustration in their voices, and the helplessness that had once threatened to overwhelm them. But those memories also fueled a fire within, a determination to ensure that no one else would have to experience the same fear. They were not seeking revenge for personal reasons alone. They were fighting for justice, for safety, and for truth. Hours passed in a blur of notes, plans, and calculations. By late afternoon, the person leaned back in their chair, exhausted but more focused than ever. They had a clearer picture of the problem, a better understanding of the players involved, and a sense of the risks and rewards. It was not a task to be taken lightly. The town's leaders were powerful, resourceful, and accustomed to being untouchable. But the person also knew that even the most powerful could be exposed with the right evidence. Strategy and timing. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, the person packed their materials and prepared to leave the cafe. They walked back toward the bridge, now bathed in the golden glow of evening light. Each step was deliberate. Each glance at the bridge, a reminder of what was at stake. They paused in the middle, looking down at the water flowing beneath, imagining the potential disaster that could occur if nothing was done. The thought sent a shiver down their spine, but it also strengthened their resolve. This was no longer just about concern or frustration. It was about taking action, about making sure that the negligence and corruption that had endangered so many could no longer be hidden. Crossing the bridge once again, they noticed the familiar gaps and cracks, each one a silent testament to the years of neglect. They thought about the people who had laughed at warnings, who had turned a blind eye to danger, and who had valued power and money over human lives. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was now mixed with a sense of purpose. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with obstacles and resistance, but they were ready. For the first time, they felt that they were in control of the narrative, that their actions could make a real difference. Back at home, they continued their preparations. Late into the night, they reviewed documents, made phone calls, and organized their findings. Each step was carefully considered, each decision weighed for potential consequences. They were building a foundation for a plan that would not only expose the truth, but also protect them from retaliation. It was a delicate balance, requiring patience, strategy, and unwavering focus. But the person was determined. They had seen the consequences of inaction and knew that they could not afford to wait any longer. Sleep eventually came, but it was restless, filled with dreams of the bridge, the town, and the faces of those who had been ignored. In the quiet hours of the night, a sense of clarity emerged. The path forward was difficult, but it was possible. And for the first time in years, the person felt a sense of hope. Hope that truth could prevail, that justice could be served, and that the town could be saved from its own neglect. It was a small hope, fragile and tentative, but it was enough to fuel their determination for the days to come. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, and they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning came with a cool breeze. Carrying the scent of wet grass and distant rain, the person sat at their desk, surrounded by stacks of papers, folders, and photographs they had collected over the past months. Each document told a story of neglect, mismanagement, and corruption. The more they studied them, the clearer the picture became. It was not just about a broken bridge or a careless town council. It was about a system that allowed greed and carelessness to hide behind polite smiles and friendly nods. Every mismanaged dollar, every unrecorded repair, every ignored complaint was a piece of a puzzle, and now they were ready to put it together. They took a deep breath and opened their laptop, pulling up financial statements and property records. The numbers were confusing to someone who did not pay attention, that they had spent months learning to read between the lines. Small discrepancies. Here, missing payments; there, unapproved contracts that had gone unnoticed. Each anomaly pointed toward a pattern. The pattern was becoming clear. Money was being siphoned, work was being ignored, and lives were being put at risk. They jotted down notes, connecting dots, drawing lines between the people involved, the documents, and the outcomes. It felt like detective work, like uncovering a hidden truth that no one wanted to see. While doing this, they thought back to the people who had ignored warnings: the town council, the HOA members, and others in positions of power. Faces came to mind, smiling in meetings, nodding politely, and then doing nothing. There was frustration in remembering how they had dismissed the problem, how they had laughed off serious concerns, and how they had tried to make the person feel small and insignificant. But anger had transformed into something else: focus. Instead of lashing out or complaining, they had turned their energy toward gathering facts, building evidence, preparing for a confrontation that would leave no room for excuses. By midday, they had created a rough outline of their plan. It was simple in concept, but complex in execution. They would gather more evidence, document every violation, and then present it to the right people. Public pressure would be needed, perhaps even media involvement. The key was not to rush, but to build a case so strong that it could not be ignored or dismissed. They reviewed each step carefully, thinking about potential risks, counterarguments, and obstacles. Every move had to be calculated because the people they were up against were not just careless, they were clever, experienced, and willing to manipulate situations to their advantage. Despite the seriousness of the task, there were moments of quiet reflection. The person looked out of the window at the town waking up, children walking to school, neighbors greeting each other, and people going about their day. Life went on, seemingly unaware of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface. The bridge still creaked, the cracks still widened, and yet the town moved forward as if nothing was wrong. This made the mission feel even more urgent. They were not only fighting for themselves, but for the safety of every person who relied on the town's broken systems. As afternoon approached, they decided to visit the bridge again. Walking slowly across the familiar wooden planks, they noted the deteriorating condition. Rusted nails, warped boards, and widened gaps were even more pronounced than the day before. They took photographs, carefully documenting each flaw, and made notes about which sections were most dangerous. Each step was a reminder of the stakes involved. The bridge was not just a physical structure, it was a symbol of neglect and the potential consequences of inaction. They felt a chill run down their spine, imagining what could happen if no one stepped up to address the problem. The thought of tragedy fueled their determination even further. Back at home, they began connecting the evidence from the bridge with the documents and financial records they had gathered. Patterns became clearer. Payments meant for repairs had disappeared. Contracts had been awarded to companies that did no real work. And reports had been falsified to hide the truth. It was a tangled web, but now they could see the threads clearly. The scope of the corruption was shocking, but it also revealed a way forward. With enough evidence, they could expose the truth, hold the responsible parties accountable, and prevent further disasters. The challenge was how to do it without putting themselves at risk. They started reaching out discreetly to people who might help. Former employees, contractors, and neighbors who had seen things firsthand. Each conversation had to be handled with care, building trust slowly and ensuring that no one acted recklessly. Some were hesitant, afraid of retaliation. Others were angry, willing to share their experiences once they realized the severity of the situation. Piece by piece, the person was building a network of information, corroborating stories, and reinforcing the evidence they already had. It was painstaking work, but necessary for the plan to succeed. Days turned into weeks, and the person continued their investigation. They reviewed documents late into the night, made calls, and followed leads that sometimes led nowhere. Small victory was celebrated quietly, finding an overlooked report, confirming a missing payment, or getting a witness to speak openly. Each setback was a lesson, teaching them how to approach the problem differently, how to anticipate resistance, and how to stay calm under pressure. Slowly but surely, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, forming a clearer picture of the corruption and the potential risks to the town. During this time, they also began preparing for the public side of the plan. They wrote statements, organized evidence, and rehearsed how to present the information clearly and convincingly. They considered different scenarios: how the town council might respond, how the HOA might react, and how the public could be swayed to take the matter seriously. Every detail mattered. It was not enough to have the truth. It had to be communicated in a way that could not be twisted or dismissed. They practiced explaining complex financial details in simple terms, anticipating questions and preparing answers that would leave no doubt. One evening, after a particularly long day, they walked through the town, observing life as it went on. Shops closed, lights flickered on, and families returned home. The bridge stood silently in the distance, a reminder of the ongoing danger. They thought about the people who had trusted the system, who had assumed someone else would take care of the problem. They felt a sense of responsibility, knowing that they could not rely on others to act. This was their mission now, and they accepted it fully. It was a heavy burden, but one that gave purpose to their actions. The work was not without personal cost. Friends and family sometimes questioned their obsession, worried about the time and energy being spent on a fight that seemed almost impossible. But the person knew that inaction was not an option. The bridge, the town, and the people living there depended on someone willing to take a stand. They learned to balance daily life with the growing demands of the investigation, carving out time for rest and reflection while staying committed to the larger goal. Slowly, confidence grew. As the evidence was stronger, the network of witnesses more reliable, and the plan more defined. They had moved from frustration to focus, from fear to cautious determination. Every day brought new insights, new connections, and a deeper understanding of the challenges ahead. The town's leaders were powerful, but now the person had knowledge, strategy, and the truth on their side. They could see a path forward, one that could lead to real change and justice. As the sun set each day, casting long shadows over the town and the bridge, the person felt a sense of resolve. They had moved from a position of helplessness to one of action. The bridge, once a symbol of danger and neglect, had become a motivator, pushing them to work tirelessly, think strategically, and prepare for the confrontation that would eventually come. The months of investigation, careful planning, and strategic thinking had transformed them. They were no longer just a concerned resident. They were a force determined to hold the powerful accountable and protect the town from disaster. By the end of part 2 of their journey, the person was ready to take the next steps. The evidence was solid, the network of support was growing, and the plan was shaping into something tangible. They were no longer reacting to neglect, they were preparing to act. The path ahead would be challenging, filled with resistance and obstacles, but they felt ready. With determination, patience, and a clear strategy, they could bring the truth to light, prevent further disaster, and ensure that justice was served. The quiet mornings and late nights of research had built a foundation strong enough to withstand opposition, and the person knew that soon their work would begin to make a real difference. The early morning air carried a sense of urgency. The person walked briskly down the quiet streets, a folder of carefully organized evidence tucked under one arm. The bridge in the distance seemed more menacing than ever, its cracks and rusted nails a constant reminder of what was at stake. Every step felt heavier, as though the weight of responsibility pressed down on their shoulders. Today, the work of months would begin to take shape in ways that could not be ignored. It was time to move from preparation to action, to turn careful, planning into visible steps that would shake the foundations of complacency and corruption. They started by visiting the town hall, a building that had long represented the power that seemed untouchable. Meetings with council members were scheduled months in advance, but they managed to slip in a time slot, requesting to discuss infrastructure and public safety. As they entered the room, the familiar smiles and nods were there, the same politeness that had always ended in disappointment. But this time, they were armed with more than words. They had photographs, documents, and witnesses ready to speak. The folder in their hands was a physical representation of months of research, evidence, and determination. It felt like carrying a small piece of truth that could no longer be denied. The meeting began, and they presented the evidence calmly, clearly, and systematically. Each photograph was shown, each document explained. The gaps in repair records, the missing funds, and the ignored warnings were all laid out in a way that left little room for dismissal. At first, some council members tried to shift blame, to minimize the findings, and to continue their polite pretense of concern. But as the person continued, carefully pointing out connections and inconsistencies, their composure began to crack. There were frowns, whispered conversations, and finally silence. The room, once filled with superficial politeness, now held the weight of undeniable truth. After the meeting, the person did not relax. They knew the public needed to be aware. They began preparing a clear, concise summary of the findings, something that could be shared with the town's residents. The goal was not to incite panic, but to inform, to show that the problems were real, tangible, solvable, if acted upon correctly. They reached out discreetly to trusted members of the community, people who had been frustrated by the inaction but afraid to speak. With careful planning, they coordinated how to present the information, making sure everyone knew their role, their words, and their evidence. Every step was designed to build credibility and avoid unnecessary conflict. Meanwhile, the bridge remained a constant concern. They visited it daily, documenting changes, noting worsening cracks, and taking photographs that could be compared over time. Each visit was a reminder of the urgency of what was at risk if the powers that be continued to ignore the danger. The bridge had become more than a structure. It was a symbol, a living record of neglect, and a warning of what could happen if nothing was done. Standing there, they imagined the consequences of failure, the potential for injury, and the lives that could be affected. It was a sobering thought, but it strengthened their resolve rather than weakening it. The work extended beyond the bridge. The person also focused on connecting with individuals who had direct experience with the mismanaged contracts and missing funds. Former employees and contractors provided detailed accounts, describing projects that were approved but never completed, payments that were received without work being done, and instructions that were ignored or altered. Each story added depth and credibility to the investigation. The person listened carefully, taking detailed notes and verifying each claim against documents, photographs, and other sources. It was slow, meticulous work, but essential for building an irrefutable case. By midweek, the person had gathered enough to start a formal presentation. They created charts, timelines, and clear explanations that could be easily understood by anyone. Regardless of experience with finance or construction, the goal was to remove ambiguity and present a story that was coherent and impossible to dismiss. Each piece of evidence was cross-referenced, ensuring that every statement could be backed up. They rehearsed presenting the material, anticipating objections, questions, and attempts to deflect responsibility. The preparation was exhausting, but they understood that thoroughness was the key to success. As the weekend approached, the town began to stir with whispers. Some residents had noticed the person's diligent work, the notes, the visits to the bridge, and the conversations with contractors. Curiosity began to grow. The person carefully managed these interactions, answering questions, providing small pieces of information, engaging reactions. They could feel the tide beginning to shift. A subtle change in how people viewed the town's leadership and the safety of the bridge. It was still quiet, subtle, but it was a sign that their efforts were beginning to have an effect. Late one afternoon, they received a call from a former contractor who had worked on town projects years ago. The contractor shared information about missing payments and falsified work reports, offering specific dates, amounts, and names of those involved. It was a breakthrough, confirming suspicions and filling gaps in the timeline. The person documented everything carefully, cross-checking against existing records. Each new piece of information strengthened the case and brought them closer to exposing the truth in a way that could not be ignored. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a reminder that persistence and careful attention to detail could uncover even long-hidden secrets. With this new information, the person began planning a community meeting. The idea was to inform residents, gain support, and ensure that the town leadership could not continue to hide behind bureaucracy and politeness. Invitations were discreetly sent, careful not to alarm anyone prematurely, but enough to gather a group who were genuinely concerned about public safety. They prepared materials, rehearsed speeches, and anticipated the questions and objections that would inevitably arise. The goal was not confrontation for its own sake, but the clear communication of truth and the urgent need for action. The day of the meeting arrived, and the person felt a mix of nerves and determination. They arrived early, setting up charts, photographs, and documents, arranging the room so that everyone could see and understand the evidence. As residents arrived, they noticed the seriousness of the atmosphere. People exchanged quiet words, some expressing relief that someone had taken initiative, others showing curiosity and concern. The person greeted attendees warmly, explaining that the meeting was about safety, responsibility, and transparency. It was clear that the bridge and other mismanaged projects were not isolated issues, but part of a larger pattern that needed attention. Once everyone was seated, the presentation began. The person spoke clearly, calmly, and with authority. Each point was illustrated with evidence, photographs showing the bridge's deterioration, documents proving missing funds, and accounts from former employees and contractors. They explained the potential risks, not to frighten people, but to make them understand the severity of the situation. Residents listened intently, some leaning forward, others exchanging glances of disbelief and concern. For the first time in years, someone was speaking the truth in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. Questions came quickly, but the person was prepared. They answered each one patiently, referencing documents, photographs, and eyewitness accounts. They clarified timelines, explained discrepancies, and made sure that the evidence was clear and accessible to everyone. The energy in the room shifted from skepticism to concern, and finally to determination. People began to understand that the problem was not just administrative or minor, it was real, dangerous, and solvable if action was taken. The room, once filled with casual conversation and polite nods, now carried a serious and focused atmosphere. Residents were engaged, asking questions, sharing experiences, and beginning to form a collective understanding of the issues at hand. After the meeting, the person stayed behind to answer individual questions, listen to stories, and gather further information. Residents shared experiences of ignored complaints, unsafe conditions, and bureaucratic obstacles. Each story was recorded, added to the growing body of evidence, and used to reinforce the larger narrative. The person felt a sense of accomplishment, but also knew that this was just the beginning. Awareness had been raised. The work of holding the responsible parties accountable and ensuring repairs and accountability remained ahead. The days following the meeting were busy. The town council and HOA could no longer ignore the growing public concern. Residents began asking questions, attending meetings, and demanding action. Media outlets showed interest, and the story began to reach a wider audience. The person continued to document everything, providing clear evidence to support the growing calls for transparency and accountability. Their careful planning, attention to detail, and dedication were paying off, but the challenge of turning awareness into action was still substantial. Throughout this time, the person never lost focus on the bridge. Each visit was a reminder of what was at stake. They continued photographing, documenting, and monitoring conditions, ensuring that any further deterioration was recorded and added to the evidence. The bridge had become a symbol of both danger and determination, a constant reminder of why the work mattered and why perseverance was necessary. Every day, their resolve grew stronger, fueled by the knowledge that the truth could not remain hidden forever. By the end of Part 3, the person had successfully moved from planning and preparation to active engagement. They had presented undeniable evidence to both the council and the community, gained public support, and strengthened their network of information and witnesses. The bridge remained a critical concern, and the challenge of holding the town's leaders accountable was ongoing, but a shift had occurred. People were paying attention, The morning air was heavy with tension. The town had begun to notice changes, though not all were visible at first glance. Whispers spread about the bridge, the mismanaged funds, and the growing frustration of residents who had long felt ignored. The person walked through the streets, observing the subtle shifts in energy. The concerned glances and the hushed conversations. People were beginning to realize that the problems were real, that someone had taken the time and courage to uncover them, and that the bridge and the town's financial mismanagement could no longer be ignored. It was a small victory, but one that carried enormous weight. That morning they received news that the bridge had partially collapsed. The message came through a neighbor, breathless and worried. The person felt a surge of shock and fear, mixed with a strange sense of validation. It was exactly what they had feared, the potential disaster they had tried to prevent for months. But it also confirmed the seriousness of the situation. The evidence, the warnings, and the concerns had been justified. The collapse was not total, and fortunately, no one had been seriously injured, but it was enough to make headlines and draw the attention of the entire town. They rushed to the scene, notebook and camera in hand, documenting everything before emergency crews arrived. The bridge, once a quiet symbol of neglect, now stood as undeniable proof of the danger. Cracked planks, bent metal, and twisted supports were visible to everyone. Emergency personnel cordoned off the area, keeping curious residents at a safe distance. The person took photographs from multiple angles, noting which sections had failed and which were still at risk. Each image, each detail, was crucial for the next steps in exposing the broader issues. They spoke briefly with the workers on site, gathering information about the collapse and confirming that the structure had deteriorated due to long-term neglect and not any isolated incident. As the news spread, the town council and HOA could no longer maintain their silence. They were forced into public statements, meetings, and interviews. Residents demanded answers, angry and fearful about the state of their infrastructure and the safety of their families. The person attended every available session, observing reactions, noting inconsistencies in statements, and continuing to gather evidence. Each meeting revealed more about the extent of mismanagement, corruption, and negligence. The council's attempts at damage control were clumsy, further validating the person's findings and strengthening the case they had been building for months. The media soon arrived. Cameras and microphones capturing images of the damaged bridge and interviews with residents. The person spoke carefully, explaining the evidence, the warnings, and the ongoing risk. They emphasized the need for accountability and transparency, presenting the facts without exaggeration or personal attacks. Their calm, informed approach stood in contrast to the council's defensive and hesitant responses. The story began to gain traction beyond the town, reaching regional news outlets. The public could see the bridge, the damage, and the failure of leadership that had been ignored for far too long. Behind the scenes, the person continued their work tirelessly. They collected statements from witnesses, analyzed documents, and cross-referenced reports to ensure accuracy. Each new piece of information strengthened the case and highlighted the systemic problems that allowed such negligence to persist. They reviewed contracts, invoices, and repair logs, uncovering additional instances of mismanagement that had been hidden. Each revelation added weight to the story and increased pressure on the town's leaders to take real action. The collapse also prompted engineers to assess the damage and create detailed reports. The person worked closely with them, ensuring that the technical findings matched their own documentation. They took careful notes, asked questions, and verified calculations. Every detail mattered, as the evidence would be crucial not only for immediate repairs, but also for potential legal action against those responsible. The engineer's reports confirmed what the person had long suspected. The bridge's condition had been ignored for years, and urgent repairs were necessary to prevent further disaster. Residents began to organize, forming committees to demand accountability and follow through on repairs. Meetings were held at local community centers, where the person shared information, explained findings, and advised on actions to take. People who had previously been silent found their voices, speaking out about safety concerns, neglected complaints, and broken promises. The town was beginning to mobilize. The person's careful groundwork allowed them to guide the conversation and maintain focus on evidence-based action. It was a delicate balance, encouraging activism without creating panic, and they handled it with skill and patience. The council and WACs attempted damage control by initiating investigations and forming task forces. However, the person had already gathered sufficient evidence to anticipate their moves. They documented the processes, noting delays, inconsistencies, and failures. Each report, each statement, each misstep added credibility to the growing case against systemic mismanagement. The person remained methodical, never allowing emotions to overshadow facts. Their dedication to truth and justice became evident to the residents, who increasingly relied on them for guidance and clarity. Weeks passed, and the bridge's repair began in earnest. Construction crews worked diligently, but the financial mismanagement and previous negligence had left a lasting mark. The person continued to monitor progress, ensuring that all work was properly documented and that no shortcuts were taken. They worked with engineers and inspectors, verifying that repairs met safety standards. Their presence acted as both oversight and reassurance, showing residents that someone was committed to protecting the town from further harm. The town's leaders faced mounting pressure. Public scrutiny, media coverage, and evidence presented by the person left them with little room to maneuver. Lawsuits were considered, audits were launched, and internal investigations began. The $4 million mismanagement, long hidden, came to light in full detail. The person meticulously documented each revelation, creating a comprehensive record that traced negligence, fraud, and misappropriation of funds. Their work ensured that accountability could not be avoided, that responsible parties would face consequences, and that the town could begin to rebuild with transparency and integrity. Throughout this period, the person remained a constant presence. They visited the bridge daily, monitored construction progress, and maintained communication with residents. They helped coordinate meetings, answer questions, and provide evidence to support ongoing legal and administrative actions. Their tireless commitment became an anchor for the community, a symbol of persistence and courage. Residents who had once felt powerless now found hope and direction through their efforts. The bridge, once a silent symbol of danger, gradually transformed. The sound of saws, hammers, and machinery filled the air as repairs progressed. Planks were replaced, supports reinforced, and rusted metal removed. Each improvement was a visible sign of progress. A testament to the person's dedication and the community's collective action. The bridge no longer stood as a warning alone, but as a symbol of what could be accomplished when truth, evidence, and determination drove change. By the end of Part 4, the disaster had exposed the full scope of corruption and negligence. The town's leaders faced accountability, the media and residents were informed, and the bridge was finally receiving the repairs it had long needed. The person had guided the community through fear, frustration, and disbelief, turning chaos into structured action. The groundwork was laid for justice, transparency, and long-term safety. The bridge collapse, though tragic, had become the catalyst for transformation, proving that persistence, careful planning, and courage could bring hidden truths to light and ensure that the town would never again ignore the dangers in its midst. The town had changed in ways that were impossible to ignore. The bridge, once a symbol of danger and neglect, now stood strong and secure. A testament to the efforts of many, but most importantly, to the unwavering determination of one person, who refused to remain silent. Walking across it, they felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a lingering reflection on everything that had led to this moment. The journey had been long, filled with frustration, danger, and uncertainty. But it had taught lessons about patience, courage, and the power of persistence. Every plank, every support, and every bolt now represented not just safety, but also the triumph of truth over negligence and corruption. The weeks following the bridge repairs were busy with meetings, legal actions, and public briefings. The person worked tirelessly, coordinating with engineers, inspectors, lawyers, and residents. Their goal was not revenge in a personal sense, but a pursuit of justice and accountability. They ensured that the town's leaders who had mismanaged funds, ignored warnings, and put lives at risk were held responsible. Legal proceedings began, and the dollar for million mismanagement was fully exposed. Those who had laughed, dismissed concerns, and ignored danger now faced scrutiny, criticism, and consequences. Watching the wheels of accountability turn brought a quiet satisfaction, a sense that the months of meticulous work had not been in vain. Residents had begun to trust the process, feeling empowered rather than helpless. Community meetings were well attended, with people sharing concerns, asking questions, and contributing ideas. The person guided these sessions, encouraging transparency, careful documentation, and clear communication. They listened patiently, answered questions, and reminded the community that progress depended on vigilance and participation. The atmosphere in the town had shifted. Fear and resignation were replaced with hope and determination. People were beginning to see that action, guided by knowledge and preparation, could change even the most entrenched systems. The media continued to cover the story, and the town received attention beyond its borders. National and regional news outlets reported on the bridge collapse, the $4 million mismanagement, and the community's response. The person appeared in interviews, presenting the facts with clarity and composure. They emphasized the importance of transparency, the necessity of accountability, and the lessons that could be learned from this crisis. Their calm, informed approach contrasted with the defensive and inconsistent statements from some town leaders. Further establishing credibility, the attention brought more pressure to ensure lasting change, which the person welcomed as part of the process of justice. Amid the public scrutiny, the person also took time to ensure the physical and emotional well-being of the community. They organized safety workshops, shared educational materials, and encouraged residents to stay engaged. The bridge was repaired, but safety was more than a physical structure. It was about awareness, preparation, and vigilance. They worked to instill a sense of responsibility in the town, reminding people that progress required continued attention and participation. The focus shifted from simply reacting to danger to preventing it. Building a culture of accountability and care, the person's role in the community became recognized and respected. People who had once been quiet and fearful now approached them for guidance, advice, and support. Their leadership was not born from a desire for recognition, but from a commitment to truth, safety, and justice. They maintained humility, emphasizing collective effort and the importance of evidence-based action. The town, once stagnant under years of neglect, now had a voice of reason and a model for how persistence and careful planning could transform a community. The legal outcomes were significant. Mismanaged funds were recovered, some leaders faced penalties. Policies were implemented to prevent similar problems in the future. The person worked closely with legal teams, providing documentation, testimony, and supporting evidence. Each step reinforced the importance of preparation, documentation, and meticulous attention to detail. It was a demonstration of how thorough, methodical action could turn months of frustration and fear into tangible results that protected the community and upheld justice. Beyond the immediate results, the person reflected on the personal journey. The months of research, investigation, public engagement, and strategic planning had changed them. They had learned patience, resilience, and the value of staying calm under pressure. They had discovered the strength that comes from standing firm in the face of opposition, and the importance of using evidence and truth as tools for change. Their sense of purpose had grown. They recognized that their actions had not only repaired a bridge, but also restored trust, empowered a community, and set an example of how individuals could make a difference.